Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. The Good Faith Podcast is a project of Redeeming Babel, and it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And one of the realities of our world today is that it is increasingly difficult to relate to one another across political difference. In churches, in neighborhoods, in any kind of context you can think of, in schools including, there's a sense that it is really hard to relate to one another in this politically polarized moment. And if you would think about an institution that should be able to help us as a society be able to relate across political difference, if you had to just design one up on a drawing board, you really would design something like the modern college or university. Because in the abstract, this institution is bringing young people from different backgrounds, sometimes very homogenous backgrounds in their own hometown, bring them to be with people of difference and diversity in a situation where you are meant to learn together, to read books, to study and talk to one another, and therefore learn how to relate one another across difference. You would think this is the model. And yet, in reality, we have seen that the vast majority of cases, this has not been happening. And in fact, quite the opposite. Alan Bloom, decades ago, wrote about the danger in his Closing of the American Mind of how American colleges and universities were not actually fulfilling this task of opening us up to difference. More recently, Jonathan Haidt has documented in his work, The Heterodox Academy, about just how closed-minded universities were making people. And I think we've seen evidence of this, even recently in the Israel-Gaza conflict, how in sometimes the most elite colleges and universities ended up being the most intolerant, the most provoking intimidation, shutting down honest debate and dialogue. And so there's many analysis out there about why this is and what's wrong. That's not what we're going to talk about tonight. Because what Good Faith Podcast really loves to do is to actually uphold examples of Christians in the world doing it right, or at least doing it better, and showing a light forward. I love to highlight stories like that. And that's what's brought me here to Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, of all places. We're tucked in Beaver Falls, in a beautiful location, with a beautiful setting, is Geneva College.
Yeah.
Geneva College is a fascinating example to me. And when I heard more about what not only what's been happening, but happening for a long time in Geneva College, I thought there's a story there that I want to highlight precisely because it may show a way forward for what American colleges and universities need to recapture as their role in society. And so here today, I have two guests, President Calvin Troup, on my right over here, and Mattigan Burleigh, a senior majoring in marketing, that's right, with a minor in biblical studies, correct?
Another major.
Another major, two majors, okay. And we're going to have a conversation about how the American college and university can do better. And we're going to talk really with a focus on what Geneva College is doing, and really interestingly, has been doing for a long time. So I'm going to start with Calvin. I want you to start by, what is distinctive about Geneva College and how it tries to prepare students to handle political difference?
Yeah, well, thanks, Curtis. I think the main thing that we start with is our curriculum and the required course in Great Issues in Politics. And that's been going on at Geneva since 1881.
Okay, a long time.
Yeah, it started out as a 3-part course.
Yeah.
So a part in theology, talking about the sovereignty of the Lord Jesus Christ as King of all nations, and then a section on domestic politics, relating to the Constitution and those kinds of things, and international politics. We only require 1 semester. But students who take the course feel like it's 3 semesters packed into one. And so that really is the core of how we start to invite people into thinking in a biblical way that's a different way than the conventional wisdom of our culture and society.
So I want to pause there and just note how remarkable this is. Because when I heard this, this is one of the first germ of the idea. I was like, I want to actually visit this and hear more about it, because I have not heard of any other college and university, Christian or secular, requiring a course on great issues in politics as mandatory for all students. Do they take this in their freshman year?
Nope.
Or when do they?
They do not,
Okay.
because they're intelligent college students. And people decide to take it usually in their junior or senior year.
All right.
Because it's rigorous and it's very demanding, and it requires all the things that they have learned in the core and in their other classes to be able to really navigate it well and get the most out of it.
Okay. So this is something baked deeply in the institutional history of Geneva College since 1881, is that what you said?
That's correct.
That's amazing tradition, and the fact that you're doing it now. So let's break this down. What is the course trying to accomplish?
The first major thing that has been true in the course throughout its history is that the starting point is that Jesus Christ is the King of all nations. That he's not going to become the King of all nations, but he actually is the reigning king. And that's grounded in biblical truth, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And so when we sing in the Messiah from Isaiah that the government will rest on his shoulders, he's risen, he's ascended, he's reigning. And so all the factors and dynamics of human politics are under God's sovereign control.
That's a pretty remarkable statement. It does, in this moment, I think, carry some resonance of concern from some audiences. It's like, wait a minute, are you teaching Christian nationalism? So,
far from it.
Go for it.
Yeah. Thanks for the Christian nationalism question, Curtis. That's really absolutely not.
Yeah.
Right. The orientation is that we're all called to be citizens of the country within which God has placed us, and to serve as citizens among the people that God has called us to live with. And so the goal is not to set up a theocracy or a Christian nation per se, but to call all government into obedience to Christ to do what it's called to do. To do what government is designed to do. And that's what gets us into the great issues.
All right, so Maddie, I'm going to turn to you. So tell me, you've taken this course.
Yes.
What year did you take this course?
I actually took it last semester.
Okay, so it's
fresh.
fresh in your mind.
Yeah.
Tell me about your experience in this course. What did it accomplish for you?
Yeah, so I had heard stories about poli-sci, but I went into it a little bit overconfident. I thought to myself, I know about politics, I know how to think, like this should be easy. This course, it's not about teaching you to believe one specific line of thinking. It's teaching you how to think through what your beliefs actually mean for your actions, and just teaching you how to think about what other people are saying.
And what was your experience like in the course with fellow students who held different political views than you did? What was that like?
So it felt like it was a very open atmosphere for me to come in wherever I was at and then think deeply about what others had to say and then go out of it wherever I landed. And not that I had to be convinced one way or the other, or that I had to be convincing someone else of a certain thing.
Let me just say, it sounds like it would be remarkably refreshing if our whole society could adopt some of these virtues that you just talked about. So again, this is why I'm at Geneva College. I'm what are you doing, and how do we actually spread some of these same virtues? And just to name some of the virtues I've just heard you say, talk about humility. I don't know everything, and things are more complex than I realized. That seems like a crucial.
Yes.
I've also heard a sense of hospitality, in the sense of you can make room for difference. It sounds like the professor did a great job of that and modeled that for all of you. Calvin, talk about these twin virtues of humility and hospitality that Maddie just has articulated, that she's experienced. Why are these two virtues so important? And I have to believe this is by design, that these virtues are
absolutely. And it's not just because they're core values of the college, which they are. But it really has to do with understanding what the gospel calls us to as people together. And so one of the main things that we want as Christians is to be hospitable. And one of the things that means is to be able to listen. How can I serve someone if I don't know what they need or what they want or what will be helpful to them? So the hospitality part of that, I think, is crucial, and so much of what happens in the Gospels is around tables.
That's right.
Right? And visiting
That's right,
and in conversation. And I think the humility part of it is really simple to say and hard to do, but Christ's humility is demonstrated in Philippians chapter 2, and we're called to have that kind of humility that thinks of others as more significant than ourselves and looks to others' interests, not just to our own interests. And so I think those are grounding things at Geneva that then not only call us, but kind of require us to practice those things and be trained in them and be thinking people as we do it.
I would add a third trait to the H's of humility and hospitality that I'm picking up, which is hope. Like, there seems to be a tremendous amount of hope in what you're describing as what is possible to actually, what's possible in terms of relating to people across differences. And especially humility and hope are twin virtues of this project called the After Party that listeners of the Good Faith podcast will know I've been talking a lot about. It's a project with David French and Russell Moore that we're leading that really anchors especially on humility and hope. And it also has hospitality because the project is really trying to create, especially in small groups, to make it a hospitable place for Christians to actually relate to each other across differences. Now, what I have discovered is that the places that are most hungry for this triple ingredients of hope, hospitality, and humility are what I would call Christians in the exhausted majority. So really broadly speaking in American politics right now, it's really been commandeered, that the dialogue and the volume has been commandeered by the far left and the far right. That their volume actually far outstrips their actual numbers, but they just dominate the airwaves, they dominate by the sheer passion and energy and vehemence by which they speak. And what we have found is that in that context where you have such loud voices on the extremes, the people in the middle just get exhausted. They just don't want to have anything to do with this. And in their exhaustion, they retreat. And in their retreat to silence, unfortunately, they cede the ground it just makes more space for the extremes to be louder and louder and start to shape reality, because the fact is that everybody else is just like tuning out and retreating back. That's the experience I have of the broader society. Maddie, I want to ask you your observation of student culture and campus culture. Is something like that happening also, maybe not at Geneva, but as you observe broadly, like the fact that people are just afraid to talk politics because they're afraid they're going to get slammed by one of the sides?
Yeah, it definitely is something that exists on campus, is that you feel like if you share a different opinion, then there's a risk to that because you might be judged and you might have to fight for your place to share that opinion. But I think for the most part, at Geneva, one of the big things that we try to do is build strong relationships. And when you build a foundation of a relationship, then that kind of takes away some of the risk.
That's right.
Because when you have a relationship, then it's okay to disagree, and it's okay to share your disagreements, because you know that that's not going to be the breaking point. And so I think when you first meet people at Geneva, it might seem like you have to kind of be a little guarded, and you might have to hold it in. But once you start to build those relationships, which you will, because Geneva is a very relational culture. So you will build those relationships, and then once you have that foundation of relationship, then there's a space that's opened up for you to be able to share however you may believe, and it's more of a conversation and less of an argument. So you don't have to defend your position. You can share your position and see how that fits in with what others have to say.
And really, if we think about what do we need to do about political polarization, in some ways, it's even less about politics as much about building relationships or rebuilding our relationships. It's in the fracturing of our common relational connection to one another that really polarization most takes roots, as we find alternative ways to find our identity and define ourselves rather than I'm the friend of so-and-so, it's I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat. So I love that point. Calvin, I want you to talk about relationships, since we're on this topic, and the importance of strong, deep relationships. When I talk to a lot of young people and I ask them what do they value in relationships, an adjective often comes up, which is the adjective nice. That what they want is everybody to be nice to one another. They want to be perceived as nice, and they're afraid if they speak up in politics on some political difference, people will think they're not nice, right? And so that niceness has sort of arisen to be the paramount virtue in relationships. You've written about niceness from a philosophical perspective and niceness in relationships. Can you give us your perspective on how ought we to think about this culture of relational niceness?
Yeah. Niceness is a problem because
niceness is a problem. Your president has declared.
Niceness is a problem because niceness leads to deceit. And it's almost automatic.
Say more.
So you can't be nice all the time without being deceitful. And it's related to trying to make the other person feel good about themselves. And that acts as niceness to meanness. And none of us want to be perceived as mean.
Right.
And the alternative to that, which is introduced many ways in many good places, is goodness. But then talk about good, not nice. What does that mean? Does that mean you're really mean to people? It's like authorization for meanness. And actually, the biblical term for it is kindness, which is often translated as covenant love or steadfast love. And so our ability to actually have meaningful relationships and conversations demands that we have relationships where people can trust that we're going to continue to love them and that our acceptance of them is not based on our agreement about political questions or preferences or other kinds of things. If they're secure in that, then we can have conversations in which we disagree, or we can have difficult conversations. Right? And our lives often demand that we have difficult conversations. And so the background condition of faithfulness and care and genuine compassion that people have experienced with us means that we no longer have to be nice and try to make them feel good about something when something isn't really good. And that's really kind of the crux of the issue.
I think this is such a profound critique of the culture of niceness. If you just think and step back and say, we are meant to create to image God. We're meant to reflect God in our own individual beings, but also in our relationships are meant to reflect God. And if you think about it, I don't think I've heard the hymn, "How Nice Thou Art." Right? Like, that's just not, that actually is not a adjective we use of God. That God is nice. That would be a very thin description of God's covenantal love. God is ever faithful, ever true, just, ever loving. But that's different than nice, right? And what you're saying is that kind of covenantal relationship, if that is who God is, then our relationships ought to actually reflect that very character, which actually involves a deeper commitment to both commit relationally to each other, but also to say things to one another or to work out differences in the way that God and us as human beings, we work out our differences in a wrestling relationship, right? In a relationship that often involves us not wanting to do what God wants and God saying, I want you to do this. And it's not about like making each other feel good. God's not out to make us just feel good about ourselves, and that's really not what God's interested in either. And so I think that's a very profound sort of wake-up call for us, that our relational hierarchy of relational values cannot have niceness at the top of it. Maddie, I want you to speak about that. How have you experienced working against just being nice as the highest good in relationships with your peers?
Yeah, so I think we need to replace the culture of niceness with the culture of genuineness. Because I think in the relationships that I value the most, I don't have to be nice all the time. Like, if I'm having a tough time, or if one of my roommates is doing something wrong, it's okay to introduce conflict and kind of introduce not happy things all the time. And the thing with those conversations is that those are genuine. And genuine relationships are so much more meaningful than merely nice relationships. You can have a lot of relationships that are nice, but when things start to get a little bit tough, then where are those relationships going to get you? But genuine relationships go a lot deeper than that. And I think that niceness is merely shallow, and it doesn't really get you very far. I was actually reading about Job just last night. It was in my devotional book. And Job's friends, they were great on the niceness, because when Job started to go through some stuff, they were like, kind of ditched him. And so I think Job there is a great example of how when you go through suffering, you need to have those deep relationships. Yeah. And you're not going to get those deep relationships by just giving in genuine flattery. But when you're genuine and honest about where you're at, then that's when you can build those foundations. And so then when conflict or suffering or tough times come, then you're not going to have friends that ditch you. You're going to have friends that can speak truth in your life and that can get you through those times.
Calvin, I want to go back to you because we've been talking about some of the institutional values here about genuineness, hope, humility, hospitality. These are great virtues that I think many leaders of churches, schools, universities out there would be like, well, I want our institution to have those values. From the inside of your institution, what does a leader need to do or embody to actually help lead an institution towards these kinds of values? Like, what's the role of leadership in all of this?
Well, I think the first thing in a school that's been around for 175 years is to understand the heritage and the mission of the school. Because we have incredible people that have been investing their lives at Geneva College, not only in this generation, but for many generations. And schools, really good schools, have a soul. And I mean that metaphorically. I don't mean schools go to heaven. Sure. But they have a soul.
That's right.
That doesn't belong to any one person.
That's right. Yeah.
And so it's presumptuous for a leader to come in and say, now I'm going to guide the school. And so, I mean, the school is moving in a direction that's been given. And so the question is to tend it and to steward it and to support the kinds of things that we know are producing that. Things like a core curriculum that's based on the understanding that all knowledge holds together in Jesus Christ. And so we have a coherent core curriculum of which great issues in politics is one part that resonate with different parts of the core curriculum so that students actually develop coordinates for thought and discernment from multiple places and multiple directions by design. It's almost as though the faculty are conspiring to educate people.
Imagine that. I love your realization that any good leader is trying to listen and be true to the soul of that institution. Here at the Good Faith Podcast, we talk about institutions all the time as actually images of God, that they are corporate, collective ways that human beings reflect and image God, because no one individual can reflect and image God completely. We need others. This is why we do this in marriages, we do this in churches. We all know that relationships are image God. We just don't often think that human institutions in their own way are the human collective imaging and reflecting of God. And that just like God has created every individual with a distinct, unique soul that is like its particular reflection of God, every institution also, whether they know it or not, whether they're secular or not, has a soul that God has said, this is the character of God that I want you especially to reflect. When you think of Geneva, and I think that's true, that the soul predates you. This course, for instance, as an expression of the Geneva's value on humility and hope, goes back to 1881. One of the things I've just loved about being here at Geneva is really the sense of that you guys seem very comfortable in your skin. I would say that you're not trying to be something you're not. You actually know who you are, you know your history, and yet you're evolving and changing. So that's a beautiful picture, and it's one that I really, I want to uphold as a point of light for us. So given that I want to uphold Geneva as a point of light for the rest of higher education, the rest of our society, I want you to actually seize the mantle. I'm giving you permission here to seize the bully pulpit here, Calvin, and say, if you could have a word or words of encouragement to your peers in higher education, other leaders, whether they're presidents or deans or provosts outside of Geneva, right? What words of encouragement would you want to share with them?
I think the first thing that's really important to understand about higher education is that it's not really an industry. That when we're doing our best work in higher education, we're functioning as educators which provide a real professional service that prepares students for a life that we don't know what it's going to be. And so we don't pretend that we know what's going to happen next in history. And so we equip people to try to help them grow into their hearts and minds. And I think it's a hard time for higher education because we're in a declining market. And so there are fewer students, there are going to be fewer institutions, and that people need to make sure that all of our schools have a meaning and a purpose that relates to our communities and that relates to the future in a way that has a long view, because higher education is not good at short view things and constant changing with every little whip stitch that happens, but rather we're designed, and we're older than corporations. We're older than many governments. Higher education has been for a long time and we need to build on that. So we're preparing our students not only for their first job, but also for all the things that are going to happen in their lives that we don't know what those are going to be. And a good education prepares people for that.
I want to follow up on that because I really love the idea of a college or a university as being institutionally uniquely in some ways equipped to play the long game, and that it actually sort of violates its distinctive if it's trying to play the short game. And that actually came to mind when I first heard that you had this course, Great Issues in Politics, as the mandatory course. Because it seems to me that if you were just trying to play the short game, if you were trying to give in to the university or the college as a purely instrumental activity, you would say, well, the mandatory course we would have would be on career search or finding your vocation or financial management or computer programming or whatever, anything that would feel like instrumentally, this will help you get a better job, get a better career. So the fact that you have made the course and have stuck to the mandatory course and have stuck to it for over a century now, well over a century on politics, draw the connection. Why is making this course Great Issues in Politics, why is that playing the long game for you, for Geneva?
Yeah, because the reality is that what we're going to experience over the next year is people telling us lies. They're going to tell us, this is the most important election in our lifetime, which is, I'm old enough now that I've heard that every election for the last 6 elections. And it's just crazy. Yeah. We have to have, one of the things that having a long game perspective institutionally and as a human being, having a sense of eternity is that it's not all about what's next. And so we have to be grounded because the Church of Jesus Christ is playing the long game.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's the institution that's going into eternity, and everything else is not. And so we have to be able to treat temporal things as temporal, but as we're preparing young people to build households that could be anywhere on the planet, providing them the equipment they need to know how to think and interact with other human beings and how to think about what the most important questions are, that happens in the core. And most of our students are going to have a life's work that's going to include some leadership because of their education, that's going to include having to work through problems that we can't anticipate. And so having a core that includes great issues in politics and big questions that never change in the human condition help people to walk with Christ through life.
Well, it seems like that actually is so much a healthier and fuller picture of politics. When we think of great issues in politics, we think great issues in the next election, right? And what you're describing is, no, politics is actually much greater and more expansive than that. It is about leadership. It is about difference. It is about discerning how to make choices. It is about compromise. And these are things that you need to learn how to do in all spheres of your life, not what is strictly described as partisan politics. You need to do that as an executive in a company, as a teacher in a classroom. Heck, you need to do that in a marriage. Right? And so learning these skills in the context of politics, that really is in the Greek, the polis, this is Greek, the life of the community and all that is involved in it. I think it's a wonderful classroom then for us, equipping us for the long game of life.
And one other thing that's really important about it is our understanding of vocation or calling is expansive. It's not code for career. And so how do you live a meaningful life as a human being with the things that all come together in our lives?
That's right.
Right? Yeah. Which include household and occupation and family and community and neighborhood and all of those kinds of things in the different seasons of life that we're called to live. There are things we need to learn at the college level to be able to practice those things well in conjunction with whatever occupational calling God has led us to.
That sounds wonderful. Maddie, is that actually happening? How are you being sent out? We've gotten the spiel. It sounds wonderful. How is this happening for you? You are about to graduate after 4 years at Geneva, 4 years, I assume. Tell us how all of this is translating into your actual life going forward.
So as I've gone through my 4 years here as a communication and a Bible major, I've felt like I've learned a lot of theory. And at the beginning of this year, I was like, what am I supposed to do with all this theory? I don't even know how to practice any of this stuff. But I've started to realize in this last year that all of this theory is providing a foundation for how to practice well. And that was especially clear when I was taking poli-sci, because one of the things that we were doing was we were learning about political theory, and then we were challenged to put it into practical scenarios. And so there would be times where Dr. Nykirk would call out a few of us and be like, hey, I'm going to give you a scenario. Tell me how your theory or your beliefs is going to help you act in this kind of tricky scenario. And as we went through those different scenarios, I started to realize that if you don't have any theory to back up your practice, then you're going to end up doing a lot of things you regret, and you're not actually going to be acting wisely.
I love it. A case for theory. No, truly, in a culture that so highly values, quote unquote, being practical, you're making a very practical case for theory. Like, we need to have a picture of what we are aiming for if we're going to make good practical decisions. All right, we're now going to take some questions from the audience. Wilhelm, you've been collecting them. Do you want to tell us?
Yeah, here we go. So we've got a good list, and a reminder, you can continue to submit your questions. Let's start with this one. How do we know when we've crossed the line from faithfully pursuing Christian values in the political realm to pursuing power for its own sake?
Calvin.
I think that one of the things that is important about being in a community is that when we're doing our best work in a political or governmental realm, we're doing work for the community and with others. And so it's important to move together. And it's hard to maintain personal power if you're trying to move and work together in that kind of context. And so seeking the good of others, not just our own good, and not translating, not making the foolish mistake of saying, well, my good must be good for everyone, is an important way to start. And so having a kind of framework that says wisdom resides not in any one individual, but in the community together, and being able to move in that way, I think, is an important check. Because then you always have good people around you saying, no, that's just, you just want power.
All right.
Yeah.
Go
If
ahead.
I could add to that
Yeah,
too
please.
a little bit, I was talking about genuine relationships, like as an opposition to niceness. I think when you have a genuine relationship with your community, then they're gonna tell you if you're doing something for selfish reasons. And so if you have a group of people that you have genuine relationships with, then they're gonna keep you accountable. And that's a really great way to know if you've started to step over the line, is when you have those relationships of people who can kind of give you feedback, and to be receptive to that feedback.
It's a great point. I have been thinking a lot about the pattern of institutional abuse, especially in Christian circles, that if you just read the headlines, you know this is just coming to light, how endemic various forms of abuse in Christian institutions are. And a highly prevalent factor in these cases of abuse, believe it or not, is actually a culture of niceness. Because it's the culture of niceness that does not actually confront and name abuse, and so that's what enables it to continue. And it's actually these relations, when they are deeply genuine, that can hold hard truths, that these institutions have a chance to confront abuse. But sometimes it's the nicest leaders and the nicest institutions that actually have covered up abuse, because it doesn't feel nice to confront these things. It doesn't feel nice to talk about these things. All right, next question.
Yes. How can Christians be involved with politics and elections while upholding a godly conscience that seeks first to support the commands of Scripture?
Okay, I want to actually ask you, Calvin, to talk about this, because you were telling me before a story of your recent interaction with some alum who are involved in politics, right? And how they've been faithful even though they hold different political views. So explain that.
Yeah. So we were in Harrisburg visiting with state representatives last week, and 3 representatives who are serving in Harrisburg currently are Geneva alums. 2 of them are Republicans and one of them is a Democrat. And they have clearly a high level of respect for one another. They know one another. They work together. And the thing that's very interesting is they're very typical Geneva people. So they love Christ. They're articulate Christians. You walk into their office, it's very clear that they're there to serve the Lord. They're very conservative theologically. And so they would hold very common views of the faithfulness of Scripture and the truth of Scripture and who Jesus is and all those kinds of things. And they're clear about that. And they're on different sides of the aisle. And their testimony about each other was what was the most important thing. Because if you worked in politics, you can tell the difference between people saying nice things about each other and people actually having genuine regard for each other. And there was genuine regard. One of the things that we talked about, would like to have one of the Republicans and the Democrats come to great issues in politics and do a debate and have to take the other side, which is one of the characteristics that sometimes happens in great issues in politics, is you have to represent a side fairly that you disagree with.
What a great story. What a hopeful story of politicians who are both Christians actually speaking in high regard for one another. May that replicate in our country. Want to go to the next question?
Yes. 2 questions about voting. One, what does it look like to love our neighbors with our vote?
Okay.
And perhaps, is it unfaithful for a Christian America not to vote?
Maddie, how old are you?
I'm 20.
You're 20, so you're not voting in this election.
I am voting.
Oh wait, you're voting. You're 18.
Yeah.
What am I doing? You're not drinking in this election.
No, she is not.
Okay, tell us how you're approaching this election from that vantage point of that question.
I think that there's more to voting than just who wins and who loses, because voting is a really good way of providing feedback on where your nation is at. And so by voting, you're sharing your opinion and you're giving your feedback to candidates. And I think that's valuable. And I think there's other ways that you can share your feedback and that you can engage with the political system.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of good ways that you can use your talents to make the world better.
Yeah.
But I think voting for me has become something like, I didn't vote in the last election, but I plan to vote in this one. And for me, it's my way of saying, hey, I think there's something right going this way. And there might be a lot of wrong things too, and there might be a lot of wrong things over here, but I'm giving my feedback that like, hey, I think there is some good that's going on here.
What I would say is get off social media,
That's right.
stop watching political TV entirely, and get active in the local community.
That's right. Amen.
Because the most important politics and
That's
the most
100%.
important government is local, and people are wonderful locally. We don't all agree, it doesn't matter. We have common interests that are obvious that we could share, and we can work on those interests from different perspectives and come to agreement because we need to for our neighborhoods and our communities and our families. And if we're not watching all the political TV and we're not paying attention to social media, then we won't mistakenly see every local community as a representation of the national community. And who's to say that the national community, that the national hubbub is the most important thing?
It's not.
Only the media says that.
That's right.
But for our lives, and this is why community engagement for Geneva College is so important, because we just have to be able to work with people who come from different perspectives, but that we live with. And it's heartening, and we can build together and work together. And there's so much work that needs to be done. People have abandoned local work entirely, and we need to get off of screens and into the community and doing that work together. That's how I think you get unexhausted. You just don't pay attention and think that your vote in the national election is the only important part of citizenship.
My only response is amen.
And amen.
And thank you. So thank you all for joining us here today. It's been a pleasure. And for all of you listening at home, I invite you once again to next week to join us around the campfire.